Welcome to the Black Woman in Law podcast, where each week we discuss the most pressing issues in the criminal legal system. I am your host, Dr. RaShall Brackney, also known as Chief D. As we get ready for today's show, don't forget to download and subscribe and follow and rate and comment wherever you listen or get your favorite podcasts. So I don't have a guest today. You know what we're doing? We're doing headlines and hashtags. So let's just start it right from the beginning. In Los Angeles this month, communities began to rise, not in chaos, not in violence, but in defense of dignity. It started with ICE raids, but not the kind you've read from years ago. They weren't focused on criminal enterprises or border threats. These were targeted and masked officers conducting operations at day labor sites and schools. Yes, schools. These raids weren't about law and order, they were about instilling fear. And the message was unmistakable. Immigrant communities were being told in the most aggressive way possible that nowhere is safe. So the people responded. They filled the streets, they marched, they chanted in English and in Spanish. They demanded revolution, they demanded humanity. They said, stop taking our neighbors in broad daylight. Stop threatening our children near classrooms. Stop tearing families apart under the guise of national security. And how did the state respond? Not with listening, not with transparency, but with the National Guard, with Marines, armed troops in urban neighborhoods, military uniforms patrolling American streets, not for disaster relief, not for recovery, but because working people had the audacity to gather and to speak out. If you were waiting for someone to call that martial law, don't hold your breath. But if you call it democracy, then you're not paying attention. In the midst of all of this, get this, Senator Alex Padilla, an elected U.S. Senator from California, was at a press conference with Kristi Noem, who is the United States Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, she was speaking at a press conference, and he was down the hall waiting for another one. And she was speaking about the conditions on ground in California and about the abuses of power that had sparked what they were calling protests or riots, which other people were calling demonstrations and the exercising of their First Amendment rights. Padilla shows up few doors down at hers. He wasn't throwing a rock. He wasn't blocking traffic. He simply tried to ask a question. And for inquiring about and for his constituents, he was forced to the ground, handcuffed, and detained by law enforcement officers in a hallway of a federal building that he would have had clearance to get into. Now, that's not procedure. That is persecution. When a U.S. senator is tackled in front of cameras for holding up a verbal microphone or megaphone for his constituents, you're not looking at law enforcement. You're looking at the state sending a message. If we can do this to him, we can do it to anyone. And to quote Senator Padilla, when he was on the floor after the incident, he said specifically, if that is what the administration is willing to do to a United States senator for having the audacity to simply ask a question, imagine what they'll do to any American who dares to speak up, end quote. And that message, though, was amplified by none other than Donald Trump, the president of the United States. His statement, quote, when they spit at people, you know, they spit. That's their new thing. They spit, we hit. If that happens, they get hit very hard, end quote. Not if they shoot, not if they threaten, but if they spit. That's not rhetoric, that's incitement. That's giving license to law enforcement across the country to use force for any perceived disrespect. When spitting is treated like an act of war, then every demonstrator becomes a target. And if you think I'm exaggerating, just look what happened when Fox News former contributor, former Army officer, and Trump ally, who is now your current head of um, security, was asked, Pete Hegseth was asked point blank if he would support or had he given the order for the military to shoot unarmed protesters. Amid all of this gaslighting, he was silent. He didn't shout down the dissent. They asked him directly and publicly under oath. And guess how he responded? On full view television, Representative Slotkin of Michigan looked Hegseth directly in the eye. Now, again, he's serving as the Homeland Secretary of Defense. She looked him in the eye, looked him in the face, and did what no one else with a level of clarity and courage has done. She asked him plainly and unequivocally if he had ever issued an order for the U.S. military to shoot unarmed protesters. Let me repeat. She asked and was forced to ask the Secretary of Defense if he had authorized American troops to fire on American citizens. And what was his answer? He laughed, he smirked, and then he said, quote, I reject the premise of your question. Not under any circumstances, not that would be illegal, unethical, and against the Constitution I swore to uphold. No, just a dismissive shrug and a politician's dodge. That wasn't a hypothetical about history. This is in the immediate aftermath of ICE raids and mass demonstrations in Los Angeles that the National Guard's troops and the Marines have been deployed to on U.S. soil in American neighborhoods during peacetime. And when asked if unarmed civilians could be or had been targeted by the military, who carry guns and have the ability for tanks, the highest ranking defense official responsible for that deployment refused to say no. So let that sit with you. In a democracy that should have triggered a full investigation, in an authoritarian regime, though, like we are experiencing, this is just another Tuesday. And to be clear, Slotkin wasn't fishing for headlines. She was actually citing precedent. She had referenced former Defense Secretary Mark Esper's account of Donald Trump ordering him to, quote, shoot protesters in the leg, end quote, back in 2020. Remember during all the demonstrations and rallies after the death and public execution of George Floyd. That wasn't a partisan question. It wasn't a partisan spin. She wasn't trying to aha and catch him. That's testimony from a cabinet secretary who said no in 2020 and was later fired. So when Hegseth deflected, what we all heard, what we all saw wasn't ambiguity, it was complicity. Because if you're given the opportunity on public record to condemn violence against peaceful protesters and you decline, that silence is not neutral. That silence is an endorsement. And in the broader context of ICE raids on schools, mass arrest at day labor sites, Marines patrolling the streets in LA, that silence becomes deafening. It's not about the one question in that one hearing. It's about the growing normalization of the military and its force possibly being used in response to civilian dissidents or civilian dissent. It's about a political climate where spitting is a provocation, where peaceful resistance is being treated like an insurrection, and where refusing to salute to power becomes punishable by blood. So when leaders dodge accountability, when they laugh it off, when they laugh off constitutional violations, when you have to ask then, who are they protecting? And more importantly, who are they preparing to harm? Because at the end of the day, the question wasn't about whether the military could be used on American soil. It already was. The question is whether they were ever given orders to shoot us. And if the secretary won't say no, we have every reason to assume the worst. And if you think that's bad, and that is the worst, Brevard County, Florida, took this logic and this rhetoric to horrifying conclusion. On June 13th, the day before the nationwide, quote, No Kings protest, there was a public military parade also scheduled, right? So this is the day before the nationwide No Kings and the military parade on June 13th, right? To commemorate the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army, which is a national milestone, not a political event. Brevard County Sheriff Wayne Ivey held what he called, quote, an anti-riot press conference. Standing alongside the Florida Attorney General James Uthmire, Sheriff Ivey addressed the public, not with reassurance, but with threats. Here's what he said, and I quote you. Quote, if any protester gets violent or breaks the law, we will kill you graveyard dead, end quote. And he didn't stop there. He then goes on to say, if you resist lawful orders, you're going to jail. Okay, I ain't got no problem with that. But then he says, if you block a roadway, you're going to jail. If you flee arrest, you're going to jail tired because we're going to run you down. If you mob roll circle a car, get this, you're most likely going to get run over and dragged across the street. If you spit on us, you're going to the hospital and then to jail. If you hit one of us, you're going to the hospital, jail, and most likely get bitten by one of our big, beautiful dogs. If you throw a brick, if you throw a firebomb, or point a gun at one of our deputies, we will be notifying your family where to collect your remains at because we will kill you graveyard dead. We're not going to play, end quote. End quote. That's not law enforcement. Folks, I did 40 years, almost 40 years, 4 decades in law enforcement. That is not law enforcement. That is a public death threat. That wasn't a rogue comment in the heat of action. This was a prepared statement backed by state's top legal officials just days before a peaceful demonstration was scheduled. And while that parade in Washington was originally designed to honor the 250-year legacy of the U.S. Army, we don't want to ignore that context. This parade wasn't born the response to the No Kings parade. This parade wasn't born out of bipartisan appreciation for the U.S. Army, which it should have been. It was born out of personal desire. When the current administration, if you remember the previous administration, Donald Trump tried to have a military parade after he had attended Bastille Day in France. He tried to schedule one during his former presidency. But now he wanted to, as a birthday tribute to himself, he wanted tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue as a display of power in the heart of the Capitol. And this year, he finally made it happen. It wasn't about military history, it was about a military spectacle. And the spectacle has consequences. Because when you put soldiers in the streets, when you put missiles on flatbeds, when you choreograph rows of troops marching past a president's birthday banner, you are no longer honoring a military. You are mimicking a monarchy. We are not North Korea. We are not a nation that goose steps in sync to hail dictators. The American military is to be honored, not idolized. They are public servants, not political props. Parade that costs tens of millions of taxpayer dollars at a time when schools are underfunded and communities are under siege, that's not patriotism. That's propaganda. And when the parade takes place while law enforcement is threatening to kill protesters the night before, we should all ask, what exactly are we celebrating? Because it's one thing to respect the uniform, it's another thing to weaponize it. And while the Army may have marched in uniform to commemorate its founding, law enforcement took those same dates and turned it into a warning. They said, if you speak out, you may not come home. So what are we seeing now? We're seeing a shift from law and order to fear and force, from due process to death threats, from public safety to paramilitary force. And all this, while elected officials are being shot in places like Minnesota, where two separate incidents, two target attacks. We don't know fully the motives yet, but the timing couldn't be clearer. In a climate where violence is normalized, encouraged, and celebrated by public officials, political targeting becomes not an anomaly, but a symptom. And still, my people, y'all kept marching. And still, y'all said no kings. And still, you showed up. Because what we're witnessing is not the fall of democracy, it's the fight for its survival. A sheriff threatening to kill protesters, a senator thrown to the ground, Marines in Los Angeles. This is not civil discourse. This is suppression. This is surveillance. This is systemic violence trying to wrap itself in a flag and call it freedom. So what do? Come on, Black Arm of the Law listeners. We demand accountability for any officer, for any sheriff, for any politician who threatened violence against peaceful protests. We demand an end to raids, especially those targeting children's schools and immigrant families. We demand a separation between military operations and civilian protests. We demand real consequences for those who abuse their power and then hide behind a badge. Because if we don't, there will be more Padillas, there will be more Bravards, more silence from the Petes of this world, and more grieving in cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul. Patriotism is not obedience. Democracy is not submission. Injustice does not begin with a threat. It it begins with truth. And so, as we travel the streets of Los Angeles to the heights of federal command, we've seen these masks, we've seen rifles, troops in the neighborhoods, not to serve, but to suppress. This past weeks, we've witnessed public officials threaten citizens, federal leaders dodge accountability, and a national celebration that mimics autocratic theater. But the power remains with us, people. Justice begins not on the battlefield, but in the ballot box, in the courtroom, in the community conversations, fueled by courage and truth. We don't need kings, we need engagement. We don't need militarized spectacles, we need transparency. We don't need obedience to power, we need accountability. And if you're listening to Black Arm of the Law, most of all, we need you to stay powerful. I am your host, Dr. RaShall Brackney. Please don't forget to download and listen and subscribe to wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Apple or any of the other ones. And always the Mean Ole Lion Media app. I am 1042, and I will catch you next week.